Jasmine Crockett walked into Congress to expose tax injustice. Nick Sortor showed up with a doctored video, a media empire behind him, and one goal: destroy her credibility on live TV. For 10 minutes, they clashed over truth, power, and race, until a single document turned everything upside down. When Jasmine unveiled a secret swatting scandal and a photo linking Sortor to billionaire manipulators, the hearing exploded into a national reckoning. One woman, one folder, and the silence that brought down an empire. So when the nation held its breath, what exactly did Jasmine Crockett say? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber doors closed with a deep metallic thud as the emergency session was called to order. The hearing was unprecedented, Congress convening not to debate legislation, but to put the ethics of the media itself on trial. Headlines had flooded the country for weeks, journalists accused of distorting public perception, shaping tax policy from behind the veil of opinion. Jasmine Crockett sat poised at the front of the committee chamber, invited as a key witness to speak on how manipulated media narratives had warped public understanding of tax justice and fueled resistance to reform. She had seen firsthand how truth had been twisted, how her own words had been clipped and repackaged to serve the powerful. But what the public hadn't expected, and what sent a ripple through the hearing room, was the name at the top of the witness list: Nick Sortor. The controversial conservative firebrand, whose viral headlines had ignited outrage against Crockett's proposals, was now under federal scrutiny. The official reason: multiple articles tied to his name had shown signs of factual distortion, selectively edited quotes, and unverifiable sources. And now he was no longer the man behind the curtain. He was in the hot seat, summoned to account for the chaos he'd helped create. The hearing room had seen its share of tense moments, but nothing like this. The tension didn't build. It arrived all at once, like a sudden drop in pressure before a storm. Jasmine Crockett sat composed, her palms resting flat on the lacquered surface before her, fingers still, eyes locked forward. She had testified before. She had debated, fought, endured. But today was different. Today wasn't about defending a policy. It was about defending truth itself. And across the room, stepping through the double doors with slow, confident steps, was the man who had spent months undermining hers. Nick Sortor entered without urgency, yet with full intention. He didn't scan the room. He surveyed it. His eyes found Jasmine instantly, and when they did, he didn't nod, didn't smile. He just looked, a long, calculating look, as if assessing whether the woman before him was truly the threat his headlines had made her out to be, or something worse, someone he couldn't control. Then, without breaking gaze, he let out a breath. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Just enough to say, "This is mine." He moved toward the table, pulled out his chair with a flick of his wrist, and sat with the kind of comfort only men used to being unchallenged ever seem to carry. The chairperson began to speak, outlining the procedural limits of the hearing. But barely 20 seconds in, Sortor raised his hand, then spoke without waiting to be recognized. "Chairwoman, if I may," he said, voice calm but edged with condescension. "Let's not kid ourselves about what's happening here. This isn't oversight. This is theater." His eyes shifted, not to the committee but to Jasmine. "We're here today because certain people didn't like what was written about them. And now they're trying to rewrite the script." He gestured broadly, his tone turning almost amused. "In a free country, we don't define transparency by how uncomfortable it makes elected officials feel. And we definitely don't hold hearings just because someone's narrative got challenged in a headline." A few committee members shifted uncomfortably. Jasmine didn't move. Her shoulders remained square, her expression unreadable. But behind her stillness was a practiced resistance, built not from pride but from years of surviving rooms like this. She had heard this tone before, the voice of a man who believed intellect and arrogance were the same thing. She had felt this posture before, the smug certainty that a woman like her would eventually crack. But this time, she wasn't here to react. She was here to expose. And she could already see it. Behind the polished suit and rehearsed swagger, Nick Sortor was bluffing, loud, deflecting. He had shown his hand too early, and Jasmine, silent, unshaken, was already beginning to see exactly where to strike. The silence that followed Sortor's provocation was taut, but it didn't last long. With a calculated flick of his wrist, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a slim black tablet, placing it flat on the witness table with a performative kind of care. His voice, when he spoke again, was low but theatrical, like someone preparing to deliver a twist in a courtroom drama he had already written. "Since we're speaking about narratives," he said, tapping the screen twice, "I think it's only fair the committee sees this." The chamber lights dimmed slightly as a monitor behind the panel flickered on. Instantly, Jasmine's face appeared on screen. Grainy, recorded in a dimly lit room, her voice clearly audible. She was seated at what looked like a small round-table discussion, her sleeves rolled up, mid-conversation. "We can't keep playing nice with these people," she was saying. "If we want real change in the tax code, we need pressure, not patience." Another voice off-screen laughed, followed by Jasmine's voice again. "Look, if the moderates won't move, we go around them. We go through them." Gasps echoed across the chamber. Sortor leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as if the verdict was already written. "This, members of the committee, is your witness," he said slowly. "A sitting congresswoman casually discussing how to override due process in collaboration with what I'm sure she'll call just community advocates, but whom the rest of us recognize as hard-left political disruptors." He gestured toward the screen, now frozen on a frame of Jasmine mid-sentence, eyes fierce, hand raised. She wasn't talking policy. She was plotting strategy with groups known to organize disruptive protests and media pressure campaigns against elected officials, against this very institution. His voice lowered into a near whisper. "Let that sink in." The panel was still. Jasmine could feel the change, not in words but in air pressure, in posture. One of the Republican committee members scribbled something hastily onto a legal pad, while another leaned in to whisper behind a cupped hand. Even the Democrats seemed suddenly quieter. Their eyes weren't hostile, but they weren't as certain as they had been minutes ago. It was a shift, a familiar, brutal one. She kept her face still, her breathing measured. But inside, something tightened. Not from fear. She had long since outgrown the luxury of that, but from the bitter taste of recognition. This wasn't just political theater. It was tactical. She had spent months working behind the scenes with community groups, financial reform experts, and legal scholars, building alliances that could pressure Congress to close the tax loopholes that let billionaires pay less than their own staff. She knew what she had said, she knew what she had meant, and she knew exactly how that clip had been sliced, reshaped, and deployed like a weapon. Sortor wasn't finished. He rose now, slowly, like a man preparing to deliver a final blow. "You can call it context," he said, pacing slightly as he spoke. "But when someone in elected office sits in a private meeting, unguarded, and talks about going through opposition lawmakers to force tax reform, that's not just passion. That's an admission." He turned to the panel. "She says the media distorts the truth. I say, let's listen to her words. Unfiltered. She says she's defending the people. I ask, since when did the people's voice come with a strategy memo from radical groups with a history of protest arrests?" He stopped walking. The committee asked if media was being weaponized. "I'd argue what we're really seeing is something worse. Elected power, weaponized in silence." Cameras clicked. Aides typed furiously. One senator looked down, shook his head slightly. No one said it out loud, but Jasmine knew. They were wondering, not whether the video was real, but whether it was enough. Enough to taint the credibility of everything she just said. Enough to shift the public perception away from the tax code and back toward a spectacle. Enough to make the truth irrelevant. She sat still, her fingers folded tightly together now beneath the table. She could feel the burn behind her eyes, but she held it. Not here, not now. What enraged her most wasn't the lie itself. It was how expertly it had been crafted to echo centuries of tactics. How quickly even good men would hesitate when a powerful black woman dared to speak unfiltered. They wouldn't call her angry, not in this room, but they would call her dangerous. And they'd say it with questions, with pauses, with procedural delay. The cut would come slow, but it would come all the same. Sortor sat down slowly, with the smugness of someone who believed he had outplayed the system. He crossed his legs, folded his hands, and looked straight ahead. Not at her. He didn't need to. His eyes said it all. He thought he had turned the tide. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. Not because she wasn't shaken, but because she had expected this. She had walked into that room knowing what Sortor would try. And now that he had laid his cards on the table, she finally saw his hand for what it was. Not strength, but strategy. Not truth, but timing. A desperate man throwing sparks in the hope of starting a fire. And she would answer, on her terms, when it mattered most. The silence after the video wasn't silence. It was suffocation. Jasmine could feel it pressing in from all sides. The doubt, the weight of insinuation, the thousand unspoken judgments clinging to the corners of the room like smoke. She had been here before, not in this exact chamber, not with cameras pointed at her, but in rooms where her words were stripped for parts and her intentions reduced to threat. And now Nick Sortor, a man who had never known the weight of silence used as a weapon, had delivered his message. Sit down. Be grateful. Stay quiet. She didn't. Jasmine stood slowly, deliberately, the legs of her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that cut the silence clean in two. She didn't ask for the floor. She took it. Her voice when it came wasn't loud, but it carried like steel. Let me be perfectly clear, she said, locking eyes with the committee chair, then with Sortor. That video, what you just saw, was doctored. She held the room's gaze. The audio has been cut, the context removed, and phrases rearranged to imply something I never said, never meant, and would never stand for. The monitor still glowed behind her, frozen on an unflattering frame of her mid-sentence. Mouth half open, hands in motion. She turned to face it. If this committee has any commitment to truth, then I formally request that a forensic authentication be performed on that recording. Immediately, not by Mr. Sortor, not by any media outlet, but by a neutral digital verification body. She pivoted back to the panel. Because I don't answer to edited tapes. I answer to the truth, and I refuse to let a spliced video become a substitute for it. She paused, not to breathe, but to let the words land. There was a new kind of silence now, not suspicion, but listening. Then with her hands steady on the table, she leaned forward slightly, her voice growing firmer, cutting closer. Let's be honest about what's happening here. A man with no lived experience of systemic injustice just played a manipulated video to paint a black woman as a threat to national order. Her eyes burned with precision, not rage, but purpose. Are we really going to sit here and let someone like Nick Sortor, someone who has never once had to navigate policy as survival, decide who gets labeled extreme? She gestured calmly toward him. A man who profits from outrage, who traffics in division, who calls himself a journalist but behaves like an agent provocateur? Her voice lowered, colder now. You want to talk about danger? Let's talk about the danger of giving a platform to a man who believes he can manufacture facts, then weaponize them against the very people fighting for those left behind by this country. She turned to the panel again, eyes sweeping deliberately across each face. This is not about what I said behind closed doors. This is about who gets to shape the truth and who gets punished for telling it aloud. Sortor shifted in his seat now, no longer smirking. His hand twitched toward the mic, but Jasmine didn't give him space to speak. Her tone became quieter, but somehow heavier. There are two kinds of power in this room, she said. The power of proximity and the power of perspective. One comes from sitting close to privilege. The other comes from having to fight every day just to be heard. She pointed gently toward herself. I know which one I carry, and I know which one he fears. For a moment, the entire chamber felt frozen. No rustling papers, no coughs, no side conversations. Just her voice steady in the center of it all. You've been told that I'm dangerous, she said softly, that I'm angry, that I want too much too fast. But I ask you, what's more dangerous? Demanding fairness in taxation or distorting facts to silence those who do? Her gaze swept the room again. Because that's what just happened here. I was silenced, digitally, surgically, and paraded as a warning. Not to you, but to everyone like me who dares to speak with clarity in a room designed to keep us fragmented. And with that, Jasmine stepped back, her breath steady, her hands returning to the table. She didn't look at Sortor again. She didn't need to, because she had just rewritten the frame, not the one frozen on the screen behind her, but the one hanging in the mind of everyone in the room. And the woman in that frame was not the villain. She was the line they weren't supposed to cross. And now they had. The room hadn't settled after her rebuttal. It had shifted. Jasmine could feel it. The tension had evolved from suspicion to discomfort, from discomfort to unease. Sortor was still seated, arms crossed, his eyes narrowed in controlled defiance. But something in his posture had changed. He wasn't smirking anymore. He was waiting, bracing. He thought the worst was over, and Jasmine, standing tall behind her chair, knew exactly what came next. She had defended herself. Now it was time to tell the part of the story no one in that room was prepared to hear. She reached calmly into a thin, red file folder resting on the table. No dramatics, no flourish, just a deliberate gesture. She held up a document, single page, stamped confidential in faded gray across the top. Her voice was low when she spoke, almost soft, but it landed like thunder. Since Mr. Sortor has taken the liberty of presenting evidence to question my integrity, she said, eyes flicking to the committee, I believe it's only fair that we do the same with his. She placed the page flat on the table. What you're looking at is an internal law enforcement report, dated March 8, 2023. It details a false emergency call, what's commonly known as a swatting, made against a sitting city council member in Ohio. The name was there, in black ink, Nick Sortor. There was a long beat of silence. No one moved. Jasmine continued. The report traces the IP origin of the call to an anonymous burner number. But what's more interesting is that the address linked to the burner phone account, used to register the number only days before the call, matched an address owned by a media production firm in Kentucky, she said, her voice growing sharper. A firm whose registered spokesperson, at the time, was none other than Mr. Sortor. The room snapped into motion. One of the senators audibly muttered, Jesus Christ. A gasp rippled through the rows of press. Staffers glanced at each other. Even the chairperson sat up straighter. The sound of fingers tapping rapidly on tablets and phones echoed behind the cameras. And for the first time since he had entered that room, Nick Sortor looked cornered. His mouth opened, then closed. His hands, once so controlled, clenched into fists. Jasmine didn't give him space to recover. The target of that swatting incident was a local official, she said, pacing slowly now, who had publicly criticized Mr. Sortor's coverage of a police brutality protest just a week prior. Coincidence? Perhaps, but the document also includes an internal memo from the local precinct warning that the hoax call nearly resulted in an armed response. Had the target not been out of town that night, this committee might be reviewing a manslaughter report. Now the room wasn't just tense, it was shocked. Sortor looked to the chairwoman, then to his legal counsel seated behind him, then back to Jasmine. She stood across from him like a mirror, quiet, steady, absolute. She wasn't yelling. She didn't have to. The truth did the shouting for her. Why hasn't this come to light before? A congressman asked, breaking the silence. Jasmine turned slightly toward him. Because the police never confirmed a direct criminal link, because no charges were filed, and because Mr. Sortor has powerful friends who specialize in burying stories before they bloom, she said. But that doesn't mean it isn't real. It means the system has been doing what it always does, protecting the people who know how to exploit it. The words hung there like smoke over a battlefield. This wasn't just a counterattack. It was a dismantling. Brick by brick, the persona Nick Sortor had built, the righteous truth-teller, the self-made journalist, the outsider punching up, was unraveling in real time. Jasmine stepped back toward her chair, but she didn't sit. Her voice dropped again, quieter now. We came here to talk about how media shapes public trust, and I think the question before this committee is no longer whether that influence exists, she said, turning her gaze once more to the panel, then directly to Sortor. But what happens when that influence falls into the hands of someone who thinks journalism is just another weapon? He didn't speak. He couldn't. And Jasmine Crockett, still standing, still steady, had just rewritten the hearing. The chamber had fallen still, but the silence didn't last. It never does when power feels cornered. Nick Sortor's chair screeched against the floor as he shoved it backward, rising suddenly with a force that startled even the stenographer seated feet away. His hand came down hard against the table, flat, open palm, a dull echo reverberating through the chamber like a gavel dropped out of rhythm. "This is a setup," he barked, voice cracking under the strain. "I'm being ambushed in front of the cameras, in front of the public, with documents that were never disclosed, never verified, never—" He stopped himself, eyes darting to the blinking red lights of the media crews still filming. Sweat beaded at his temple. "This entire hearing is political theater," he growled, "and that file, whatever it is a damn smear job." No one moved to stop him. No one needed to. The outburst did its own damage. In rooms like this, control is currency, and Sortor had just thrown his on the floor. The chairwoman's gavel came down once. "Mr. Sortor, regain your composure. This is a congressional proceeding, not a press conference." But the damage was already rippling outward. A junior congressman who'd earlier nodded along to Sortor's talking points now leaned into his mic with a pointed question. "Mr. Sortor, were you ever formally affiliated with the media firm mentioned in the report?" Sortor didn't answer. "Did you profit, directly or indirectly, from its coverage of that city council member?" Silence. Another voice followed, sharper. "Were you aware of the burner phone account tied to that address?" The questions weren't accusations. They were surgical strikes, each one peeling back a layer. Across the room, reporters began shifting in their seats. One stood, speaking quietly into a headset as she moved toward the rear exit. Another typed furiously, eyes never leaving her screen. Within moments, two others slipped out, press passes swinging, phones already pressed to ears. The hunt for confirmation had begun. Sortor looked around and saw it. The fracture, the erosion, not of argument, but of belief. The men and women who championed him just hours earlier, the ones who had praised him as a truth-teller, a thorn in the establishment's side, were suddenly quiet. No defenses, no interruptions, just distance. His voice tried to rise again, but this time it faltered. "None of this proves anything," he said, softer, yet no less frantic. "It's circumstantial. It's manufactured. She's doing this to distract you." He pointed toward Jasmine, his hand trembling slightly. "She's weaponizing innuendo because she can't stand being challenged, because I told the truth about her." But his words landed differently now, fragile, scattered. What once sounded like defiance now rang of desperation. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was certainty, and it hurt more than 1,000 rebuttals. Another committee member, this time from the majority party, leaned forward. "Mr. Sortor," she said, "do you deny having any knowledge of the swatting incident?" The room stilled again. Sortor's jaw clenched. "I've never," he began, then stopped. "I wasn't involved." But the phrasing was off, the pause too long. The room noticed. At the rear of the chamber, a television monitor flickered. News banners had already begun scrolling across major networks. "Breaking: Journalistic ethics hearing erupts as allegations surface against conservative commentator." Sortor saw it too. For a moment, his entire face shifted. Not just frustration, but fear. Not of jail, not of guilt, but of something worse in his world, irrelevance. And those who had once aligned themselves with him? They began to lean away. The air was thinner now. It didn't feel like the same room. Just moments earlier, Nick Sortor had been the loudest voice in it, his fist pounding the table, his voice charging the space like a live wire. Now he sat in a defensive slouch, breathing shallow, surrounded by the weight of unanswered questions and retreating allies. He glanced again toward the door, where the reporters had slipped out, as if still hoping someone, anyone, might return with a narrative that could save him. But nothing came. The microphones stayed live. The cameras stayed on. The silence around him swelled like a tide. And across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She stood with her hands calmly resting on the edge of the table, her body poised but relaxed, utterly still, utterly present. Her eyes were fixed on him, not wide, not angry, just fixed, focused. Her stillness wasn't empty, it was full, full of all the things she didn't need to say. And that silence did something his accusations couldn't. It broke the tempo. Sortor fidgeted, eyes shifting left, then right, avoiding her gaze, then circling back like a moth drawn to the flame he knew would burn him. She didn't blink. Her silence wasn't passive, it was surgical. It exposed what his shouting had concealed, that he had no more moves, that the rage was a shield, that underneath the talking points and indignation lived a man who was simply afraid of being seen. The committee noticed, everyone noticed. The woman who had been accused of manipulation, extremism, and dishonesty was silent, and her silence said more than his entire defense ever could. Then, as if on cue, the lights in the back corner of the room dimmed slightly. A second monitor lit up. No sound, no narration, just an image. One photo, grainy, cropped at the edges, time-stamped in the corner. It showed Nick Sortor sitting at a private table in a dimly lit wine bar in Georgetown, flanked by 3 men in Navy suits. 2 of them were instantly recognizable to anyone who followed media politics. High-ranking executives from a PAC-funded digital outlet linked to multiple disinformation campaigns. The third was a well-known hedge fund billionaire, publicly apolitical, but quietly suspected to be the bank behind several ultra-conservative media startups. In the photo, Sortor was leaning forward, smiling, not the aggressive smirk from earlier, but something else. Cooperative, pleased, and in front of him sat a closed manila folder, a pen, 2 empty glasses, no captions, no quotes, just the image. Sortor's body jerked slightly in his chair, like someone had thrown cold water in his face. He stared at the screen, unmoving, his eyes scanning the corners of the frame, trying to calculate what it meant, what they knew. Jasmine still hadn't spoken. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "This photograph," she said evenly, "was obtained through a subpoenaed text exchange with a known political media consultant, dated 4 weeks before Mr. Sortor began publishing a coordinated series of op-eds targeting Congresswoman Crockett's tax reform initiative." Her voice remained procedural, but the weight beneath it was unmistakable. The photo was shared with the caption, "Green light confirmed. Distribution phase begins Monday." Sortor inhaled sharply, too sharply, and for a moment it looked like he might speak, but he didn't. His lips parted, then closed again. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't dig deeper. The still image stayed on screen. The timestamp glared like a wound. And still, Jasmine remained motionless. She could have spoken. She could have finished him. She had the right, the stage, and the proof. But she knew better. Words weren't needed now. Power didn't scream. Power waited. The silence grew dense again. Not empty. Full of things nobody wanted to name. Everyone in the room had witnessed the transformation. Moments ago, Sortor had been a media provocateur, a bold voice of dissent, a figure who weaponized controversy and reveled in confrontation. Now he looked like a man who'd walked into a room he thought he controlled, only to find it belonged to someone else. And Jasmine? She looked like the reason why. Behind her, silence was the memory of every time she'd been silenced. Every room she'd walked into where her tone was policed, her expertise second-guessed, her identity politicized. Every time she'd had to work twice as hard to say something half as loud. Now she said nothing, and it shook the foundation. A younger staffer in the corner let out a barely audible exhale, like someone realizing for the first time that the ground had shifted under their feet. Jasmine finally looked away from Sortor, but not in retreat. She turned her attention to the committee, then to the monitors, then back to the people watching behind the cameras. Her silence was no longer about restraint. It was clarity. The chairwoman folded her hands. "Mr. Sortor, do you wish to respond to the image before the committee proceeds?" she asked, her voice taut with formality. Sortor didn't answer. His throat worked, but no sound came. The chairwoman waited 2 seconds, then moved on. "Let the record show the witness declined to comment." Another click of the gavel, another shift in the room, and Jasmine Crockett, unmoving, unspeaking, had just said everything. The chairwoman folded her notes with care, then looked up slowly. "Mr. Sortor," she said, her voice formal, but not without weight. "You have the right to make a closing statement before this committee." Her words cut through the silence like a knife through fog. No one else moved. Cameras stayed fixed, phones hovered, ready. And for one suspended moment, all eyes turned to him. Nick Sortor sat still. His shoulders rose and fell in a slow breath. On his face was something approaching calculation, some final effort to reshape the wreckage. He knew he had two doors in front of him. One marked retreat, the other escalation. One would cost him influence, the other everything. And then, without standing, he chose. "I refuse," he said, voice low but sharp, "to play the part you've all written for me." The room stiffened. "I came here expecting bias," he continued, rising now, his hands no longer trembling but clenched at his sides. "But what I walked into was something much darker. This isn't about facts. It's about narrative control. It's about power brokers using elected office to threaten independent voices." He gestured broadly to the committee, to the staffers, to the cameras behind them. "You think this is justice? This is a purge. You dress it up in procedure, but it's the same old Washington. Suppress dissent, protect the insiders, silence anyone who won't play along." He turned, full-bodied now, and locked his gaze on Jasmine. "And as for you," he spat, "you've weaponized your identity, your platform, your silence. You call it truth, but it's performance. You talk about inequality while dining with lobbyists. You stand there and let them destroy me, because you know you can't win in the open." The words hit the air with venom, but they didn't land. They wavered, heavy with accusation but light on credibility. Still, he pressed on. "You accuse me of being compromised?" he barked. "How many campaign donations came in after your last televised clash? How many PACs sent checks when you played the victim on prime time?" He was spiraling now, grasping for volume in the absence of evidence. This is why people don't trust Congress. This is why America's sick of the charade. Because you don't answer to the truth. You answer to polls. The chairwoman raised her hand. "Mr. Sortor, this is a closing statement, not a campaign rally." "Don't pretend this was fair," he snapped, face reddening. "From the moment I walked in here, you had already decided who the villain was." Then he turned back toward the table, exhaled, and finally sat. He believed he had just seized the room back. He believed he had reframed the moment as martyrdom. But belief is a fragile thing. Because just as the chairwoman was about to close the session, another voice cut through the chamber. "Madam Chair," said Representative Delgado from the third row, a moderate with a reputation for staying silent in spectacles like this. "With your permission, I'd like to enter one last item into the record." Sortor froze. The chairwoman hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed." Delgado pulled out a slim flash drive and handed it to the staffer. Within seconds, a soft chime echoed as the monitors flickered to life once more. No video this time, just audio. A scratch of static, then a voice. Sortor's, clear, calm, caught. "Look, if we want to make this Crockett bill radioactive, we can't just argue policy," his voice said. "We need public sentiment, fear. I can have a piece out by Monday, strong language. Push the narrative that she's working with radicals. Tie it to protests, tax hikes, whatever sticks." Silence. Then a second voice responded, unidentified. "We'll fund it. Standard amount." Sortor again. "Half up front. I'll make it ugly." The audio clicked off. No commentary, no questions. Just oxygen leaving the room. Sortor looked like stone, cracked and hollow. The words had played in his own voice. The delivery was unmistakable. And this time, there was no ambiguity, no context to argue, no cut to blame. He was not the victim of a narrative. He was the architect. The committee didn't speak. They didn't have to. The weight of the audio filled every corner of the chamber with one cold, final truth. Nick Sortor had taken money to distort the truth and target a member of Congress. And now it was public record. Cameras zoomed in. The press gallery erupted into furious typing. The silence was no longer contemplative. It was seismic. Jasmine Crockett still hadn't said a word, but across the room her composure remained intact, unshaken, because now the burden to prove had shifted. Now the spotlight was on the man who built his career by casting it on others. And this time, there would be no more spin. The breath in the chamber had already thinned to a whisper when the last syllable of the recording died, and into that stunned quiet the chairwoman spoke with a measured calm that felt almost merciful. She reminded everyone on the committee that congressional decorum forbade any further outbursts, then stated, without flourish, that the evidence introduced placed the integrity of Mr. Sortor's testimony in irreversible doubt. Her gavel struck once, a clean, resonant note that sounded less like punishment and more like confirmation that an unseen line had been crossed. Two uniformed sergeants-at-arms moved from the side aisle in precise, unhurried steps, each nodding in deference to the dais before approaching the witness table. One leaned down and spoke softly to Sortor, who answered with a frantic whisper no microphone could catch, his eyes roving for allies that no longer existed. The chairwoman waited exactly 5 beats, enough for every camera to capture the moment he realized the fight was no longer his to direct. Then she repeated for the record that Mr. Nicholas Sortor was excused from further participation and instructed to leave the chamber immediately. The words "pending federal inquiry" slid into the public transcript like an ice blade into velvet. Sortor's indignation flickered into panic, then into a hollow nod. He rose, shoulders collapsing inward, and followed the officers with the trance-like obedience of someone who finally understands that no volume of protest can unring a bell already struck. The sight of his retreat traveled through the room like an exhale no one dared take until now. Jasmine Crockett did not track him with her eyes, did not shift her weight, nor did she release the quiet strength she had been holding like a drawn bowstring. The committee members' murmurs fluttered around her. Statutory citations, requests for recess, whispered disbelief. But she treated each rustle as distant weather, nothing more. Seconds stretched into a hush so dense it felt padded, the kind of stillness that follows a lightning strike when everyone waits to hear if the tree will fall. Yet she spoke no victory words, offered no "I told you so" smile, because this had never been about spectacle for her. The injustice she fought did not end with one man's implosion, and she would not dilute that truth by savoring it. Instead, she pressed her fingertips to the cool lacquer of the table, grounding herself in the smallest fact of the moment. She was still standing, and the record now bore more truth than it had when she walked in. Behind her, the monitors dimmed to black, leaving nothing but the committee seal glowing in silent judgment. In that glow, she breathed once, slow and deep, as if inhaling back every fragment of narrative that had been twisted against her. When the chairwoman formally announced that a bipartisan subcommittee would coordinate with the Justice Department to open a full federal investigation into Mr. Sortor's financial entanglements and potential witness intimidation, Jasmine simply inclined her head. The gavel came down again, once, twice, pronouncing the hearing adjourned. No applause followed, only the low rustle of stunned lawmakers recalibrating their understanding of which stories carry weight and which crumble under evidence. Cameras flashed in rapid staccato, desperate to frame the aftermath for an audience already glued to news tickers. But Jasmine moved with the deliberateness of someone refusing to be reduced to headline fodder. She withdrew a single legal pad from the stack of folders in front of her, closed it with reverent care, and slid it into her briefcase. Its pages held scribbles of strategy, quotes from economists, and margin notes about families whose tax bills dwarfed their paychecks. Those were the voices she carried out of every room, the proof that her fight was larger than any scandal. A pen rolled toward her as the table vibrated under shifting bodies, and she stopped it with a fingertip, another tiny act of control reclaimed. She snapped the briefcase latch, the metallic click crisp against the soft buzz of committee aides gathering discarded note cards. Her coat, draped across the chair back, swung over her arm with a fluid motion, practiced by someone who has learned never to let clothing become armor. She paused only long enough to glance at a young staffer who had watched the entire hearing with wide, startled eyes. Their quick, silent nod carried gratitude and understanding in equal measure. Then she stepped from behind the witness table, heels tapping in a rhythm that felt less like departure and more like punctuation. The aisle seemed longer on the way out, lined with faces rearranging themselves into new expressions of respect or relief or unresolved curiosity. Reporters who earlier jostled for sound bites now parted in a subtle choreography, holding out microphones they knew she would not take, whispering her name in tones that mingled hope with caution. She kept her gaze forward, not in avoidance but in discipline. The story she needed to tell next would not be squeezed into a hallway quote. Flashbulbs painted strobe white rectangles across her vision, each burst a reminder that silence can roar louder than any statement read into record. A few feet from the exit, the chairwoman called after her, voice warm with a respect that hadn't existed hours earlier, promising to forward certified copies of all new evidence. Jasmine thanked her without turning, trusting the words to find their mark, because the work between them had only just begun. At the threshold, she paused, letting the weight of the room's shifting gravity settle behind her, feeling the shift echo in her bones. For one instant, she thought of the mothers who had emailed her at 3 a.m. about grocery bills, of the retirees who sent handwritten notes because they couldn't afford stamps twice a month, people for whom tax policy was not theory but survival. She inhaled, tasted the recycled air, and stepped into the corridor beyond. In that corridor, sound returned in waves. Distant printers, polished shoes scuffing marble, the muted drone of cable news anchors broadcasting her silence like a manifesto. She kept moving, paced and steady, the briefcase swinging lightly as if unburdened by the weight it carried. A junior correspondent called after her, voice quavering with desperation, but she offered only a slight respectful smile and continued. Some battles are won in words. Others are won when words are no longer necessary. Beyond a set of tall windows, a gray winter sky hovered, clouds roiling like ink in water, yet somewhere behind them was sun. She knew that from experience. She reached the elevator bank, pressed the call button, and allowed herself one small exhale. A release, not of tension, but of anticipation for the fight still ahead. When the door slid open, she entered alone, the space echoing with the soft hum of machinery and the steady beat of her own heart, which reminded her that victory rarely looks like celebration. It often looks like a woman leaving a room after truth has done its work. And back in that chamber, chairs scraped and papers shuffled as staffers prepared summaries for tomorrow's headlines. But nothing would erase the hush that had settled the instant evidence eclipsed rhetoric. Senators who once angled for Sortor's approval now conferred in tense clusters, the political calculus of loyalty rewritten in real time. Lobbyists checked their phones with grim faces, already plotting new strategies to distance clients from the fallout. The chairwoman dictated formal language for a referral to the Justice Department, her voice precise, unemotional, yet edged with something close to resolve. One aide gingerly powered down the monitors, careful not to disturb the lingering image of that Georgetown dinner, as if the screen itself had become sacred evidence. In the corner, a lone janitor waited to return chairs to their original alignment, sensing instinctively that whatever had happened today, these seats would never quite sit the same. The door through which Jasmine had exited clicked shut, leaving behind an emptiness more eloquent than applause. And in the stillness that followed, the chamber seemed to recognize its own echo, the sound of a narrative rewritten not by volume, but by the quiet certainty of a woman who understood when to speak and when silence could thunder loud enough for the nation to hear. Outside, as Jasmine crossed the marble portico, a breeze lifted the hem of her coat and carried with it the muffled hum of traffic, distant sirens, and a city already stitching this moment into memory. The Capitol dome loomed above, both beacon and burden, its white stone glinting in the muted daylight like a promise that democracy, for all its fractures, could still bend toward accountability. She adjusted her collar, felt the coarse fabric beneath her fingertips, and let her shoulders square beneath a weight that was familiar but newly buoyed by vindication. Somewhere behind her, the buzz of cameras resumed, the chase for headlines as tireless as ever, yet somehow quieter in her mind. She descended the steps, each footfall a steady drum beat that matched her pulse, measured, calm, prepared for the next hemisphere of the struggle. At the sidewalk, a black sedan waited, its driver watching respectfully in the mirror, engine idling in a gentle purr. Before reaching for the door handle, Jasmine paused, letting one last moment settle in her chest, a still point in a spinning world, a breath of clarity earned through restraint. Then she slid into the back seat, placed the briefcase on her lap as though it were fragile glass, and nodded once to the driver. Behind her, the grand doors of the Capitol closed with a low, resonant echo, sealing in a silence that would reverberate across headlines, living rooms, and legislative offices for weeks to come. And as the sedan rolled forward into the gray afternoon, the woman inside carried with her a victory that needed no cheer, no banner, no sound, only the quiet certainty that truth, once unbound, can find its own voice and speak for generations. The moment the gavel fell for the last time, a clip no longer than 41 seconds leapt from obscure C-SPAN archive to the illuminated pulse of 100 million devices, and by dawn's first glow in Maine, it had already swept westward through high school group chats in Des Moines, break room televisions in Denver, and late-night talk show punchlines in Los Angeles, converting the once routine spectacle of a congressional hearing into something mythic, an unguarded tableau of a poised black congresswoman letting documented fact dismantle a pundit's empire built on distortion. And every share, every frozen frame, every hastily captioned meme amplified the feeling that the country had just witnessed not a footnote of procedure, but a seismic calibration of moral gravity, a proof that in an era allergic to nuance, raw, unstage managed truth could still bend the arc of power. Cable producers scrambled to reframe narratives they had first approached as partisan theater. Yet no matter how many think tank guests they booked, or how urgently on-screen chyruns flashed breaking, the momentum stayed outside their control, living instead in subway tunnels where commuters replayed the hearing on cracked phone screens, in community colleges where adjunct professors paused economics lectures so students could plot the lineage between tax loophole activism and media manipulation, and in a million text threads where cousins and coworkers who rarely talked politics circulated the clip with the breathless caption, "Watch the silence at 2:07. This is what strength looks like." When legacy outlets belatedly launched deep dive retrospectives on the Georgetown photograph that tied Nick Sortor to dark money patrons, they discovered the younger audiences they sought had already moved ahead, establishing Discord servers called Receipt Rangers to crowdsource FOIA requests, spinning up open-source browser extensions that watermark videos with chain-of-custody metadata, and organizing Zoom panels where teenage coders explained forensic audio analysis to retirees who had once assumed that a news anchor's tie color signaled credibility, all of which shifted the cultural question from, "Can we trust the press?" to, "Why did we trust them without proof?" Within the first week, an independent data collective charted a 700% spike in small-dollar donations to civic media watchdogs. By the second, elected officials in 6 states pre-filed bills mirroring what commentators dubbed the Crockett Clause, legislation requiring any outlet receiving government press credentials to disclose major shareholders and political advertisers in a machine-readable database, while lobbyists who once skated through oversight found themselves grilled on camera by first-term representatives who pulled no punches and cited the hearing as precedent for demanding transparency at the speed of the internet, a phrase that migrated onto protest banners and late-night monologues alike. Mainstream anchors eager to regain relevance invited Jasmine Crockett for exclusive interviews, but she declined the highest-rated slots, reasoning that the airtime should feature policy experts who could untangle the labyrinth of tax codes for families drowning in April paperwork. Instead, she traveled district by district, sometimes unannounced, touring union halls at dawn, sitting on milk crates outside corner stores, and answering questions that never appeared on televised roundtables. Questions about eviction notices, prescription copays, and why paycheck withholding felt heavier than ever. Even as the press trailed her caravan like weather chasers, desperate for a quote that might bottle the storm of trust she carried. Despite that restraint, her legend outpaced her schedule. Muralists in Oakland painted her profile beside the words, "Silence is a weapon too." Buskers in Chicago riffed jazz solos nicknamed Crockett Crescendo, that began with a single sustained note and built into triumphant chords, and a retired librarian in Tallahassee mailed her personal first edition of the narrative of Frederick Douglass with a handwritten letter praising the power of deliberate quiet, a phrase journalists seized upon to define the episode's rhetorical uniqueness. Because Jasmine, unlike many heroes minted by virality, had won by what she withheld as much as by what she delivered. Meanwhile, Sortor's empire fractured under the glare of documented payoffs. Affiliate stations scrubbed his syndicated segments from archives, advertisers distanced their brands with templated press releases about values alignment, and former colleagues, once eager to ride his algorithmic surf, penned scathing Medium essays claiming they had always suspected unethical sourcing, though leaked Slack logs later revealed they had celebrated the click-through spikes his manufactured outrages produced. A hypocrisy that students dissected in media ethics seminars as proof that institutional correction often follows public disgrace rather than moral epiphany. In Columbus, San Antonio, and Seattle, pop-up newsrooms sprang from repurposed shipping containers in church basements, staffed by displaced indie reporters who crowdfunded expenses with $5 monthly pledges from viewers insisting on receipts or nothing. Those micro-news hubs published exposés that mainstream editors had once tabled for fear of litigation. And when one of them uncovered forged water testing data near a Midwestern chemical plant, the health committee chair cited the post-Sortor era of citizen vigilance while announcing emergency hearings, a declaration that landed on the front page of the Washington Post next to a photo of college freshmen raising homemade boom mics at a city council meeting. For Jasmine, the din crested 3 weeks later when she agreed to a single long-form interview on Public Square, a PBS Sunday program known for giving guests unbroken blocks of time. Under studio lights softened to an amber glow, she spoke at length about wealth extraction, algorithmic despair, and the moral duty of officials to refuse defamation, even when fighting back is less glamorous than trending, her cadence steady but unsentimental. And when the host, in the final minute, asked whether she regretted detonating a scandal that felled a man's career and cost dozens their jobs, she paused, letting the steady hum of the studio become audible to both of them, then smiled, wide but not unkind, and answered, "No, because truth doesn't need a bodyguard. It only needs someone willing to open the door." That single sentence ricocheted across social networks like a psalm for the chronically misinformed. Lecturers in rhetoric parsed its cadence. Theologians praised its moral clarity. Entrepreneurs printed it on tote bags whose proceeds funded local investigative desks, and a late-night comic called it the shortest closing argument in congressional history. But the phrase's real power resided offline, whispered between exhausted public school teachers, photocopying lesson plans, repeated by warehouse workers timing break room scrolls, and taped to the dashboards of rideshare drivers, who, for once, felt a politician had spoken to them without translation. In the weeks that followed, pundits debated whether the Crockett wave would endure beyond a single news cycle, but the evidence of permanence unfolded quietly. A journalism graduate program added a course titled Silence as Strategy. Union organizers clipped the 41-second hearing video into orientation sessions on corporate disinformation, and when an oil-funded think tank attempted to smear a Navajo water rights activist using a deceptively edited clip, local high schoolers dismantled the video's metadata on TikTok within hours, forcing a network retraction and proving that the public had evolved past uncritical consumption. This response, cascading across regional newscasts, prompted a columnist at The Atlantic to declare, "The nation's bullshit meter is finally self-calibrating." And somewhere amid the interviews she declined, the bills she drafted, and the countless constituent letters she answered by hand at 2 a.m., Jasmine Crockett found herself standing in the muted dawn light outside her Capitol office, watching crews remove outdated satellite dishes from a media annex scheduled for renovation into a public demonstration studio, realizing that the edifice she had toppled was not just Nick Sortor's career, but an architecture of intimidation so old it had weathered generations, yet fragile enough to crumble when confronted by a silence wielded with surgical honesty. An honesty that, like the rising sun, required no applause and cast its glow on anyone brave enough to look without blinking. The roar of headlines faded into a charged hush, and in that hush, a single insight unfurled. When deception finally stalls, it is not volume that wrecks it, but the unblinking stillness of a conscience unwilling to barter accuracy for applause. Jasmine Crockett's poised silence, captured in a freeze frame that rocketed through every feed, recalibrated moral gravity across the nation, proving that unscripted truth still bends power in an era drenched in performative outrage. Viewers recognize that discipline can slice deeper than diatribe, that calm, held long enough, transforms into a blade keener than any rhetorical flourish. In that moment, she rewrote the physics of influence. Noise cannibalizes itself in the presence of immovable fact, while patience resonates outward like a tuning fork, aligning hearts battered out of rhythm by sensationalism. The lesson felt electric because it cut across partisan reflex. It reminded audiences that democracy begins not with winning a shout match, but with guarding the factual bedrock beneath the din. Her victory demanded a recalibration of assumptions. Perhaps the most radical act now is restraint. Perhaps the most disarming weapon is refusing the choreography of conflict. That idea raced through group chats and lecture halls, giving new shape to the very whispers that had once tried to shrink her presence. She showed that the tool historically used to brand outspoken women, silence, could be seized as a counter-weapon, melted down, and reforged into armor. There, in a single chamber, centuries of buried voices found a modern echo, and it thundered louder than any gavel strike. Yet beneath that thunder lay a deeper lesson about inequity, about how injustice rarely announces itself with flashing sirens, but slips through boardroom doors in whispered deals and carefully edited tapes. Reputations are not merely damaged by rumor. They are sculpted in advance by gatekeepers who gamble on a public too weary or too cynical to question who funds the microphone, who owns the platform, who edits the reel. Jasmine's ordeal exposed that machinery. She peeled back the siding and revealed the gears, forcing Americans to confront a sobering fact. Much of what masquerades as balance is a tightrope strung by those who profit from imbalance. Her detailed evidence redefined complicity, showing that every unchecked narrative is a currency transacted between power and complacency. The injustice she faced was not a single smear, but a networked ecosystem set to devour the credibility of dissenting voices while laundering disinformation as legitimate concern. In letting documentation speak louder than indignation, she flipped the cost ledger. Peddlers of distortion now paid in lost influence, while seekers of truth gained the priceless commodity of public trust. That shift recentered the conversation on root causes, loopholes that starve schools and fill offshore accounts, paywalls that monetize confusion, algorithms calibrated to fatigue civic curiosity. By dragging the unseen economies of influence into daylight, she forced every viewer to ask whether they had unknowingly invested their attention in a market of lies. Suddenly, verifying sources felt less like homework and more like self-defense, a recalibration of civic reflex that would ripple long after trending hashtags dimmed. Injustice, once an abstraction, wore a face, a voice, a spreadsheet, and a timestamp. And once seen, it refused to be unseen. From that exposure grew a lesson about courage, not the cinematic kind that charges barricades, but the quieter variety that stands unflinching while an architecture of intimidation exhausts itself. Courage was a woman refusing to speak when provoked, trusting that silence could hold the weight of centuries of dismissal without cracking. Courage was knowing the cameras sought an outburst, to edit, to meme, to monetize, and giving them nothing but disciplined stillness instead. It was the choice to weaponize composure as a rebuttal to every coded dismissal, too loud, too emotional, too ambitious, that had ever trailed her career like barbed wire. In 30 televised seconds, she mapped the emotional topography of restraint. Shoulders squared, breath measured, gaze unwavering, a tableau of poise that turned decades of bias on its head. The gambit worked because it subverted a pattern older than the room itself. It forced adversaries to fill the silence, revealing their own hollowness. She proved that the line between dignity and defiance can blur into a single stance so grounded that chaos ricochets off it like hail off marble. That stance became a lighthouse for viewers who, for the first time, saw poise reframed as protest, patience reinterpreted as power. Courage, the nation learned, is sometimes choosing not to match force for force, but to let falsehoods collapse under their own weight. And the echo of that choice traveled into classrooms, council chambers, and kitchen table debates, teaching that bravery can be measured in controlled breaths as surely as in battle cries. Intertwined with courage came a lesson in responsibility, illuminating the civic mandate to rebuild information filters hacked by algorithmic despair. When Jasmine lifted receipts instead of raising her voice, she invited citizens to treat every headline with the skepticism they reserve for street corner gossip, to demand metadata as fiercely as they once demanded catchy slogans. Grassroots networks sprang to life, compiling open-source toolkits for verifying video provenance, drafting templates for FOIA requests, and running pop-up workshops where teenagers taught grandparents how to read domain registries. Each small act of collective verification became a load-bearing beam in an emerging architecture of vigilance, a structure stronger than any single watchdog group precisely because it was decentralized. The message was clear. Democracy disintegrates not when liars lie, but when listeners cease to question. And the antidote to propaganda is not cynicism, but painstaking curiosity. Her silence hadn't just unmasked one manipulator, it deputized millions to audit their own attention. Suddenly, fact-checking was not a niche hobby, but a civic ritual, and libraries, once starved for relevance, found themselves hosting standing-room-only media literacy nights. That shift went beyond punishing a fallen pundit. It rewired the reflexes of a public too long numb by the constant hum of misinformation. In this new rhythm, every scroll became an opportunity to pause, evaluate, and decide. An invitation to guard the gates of perception rather than leaving them on autopilot. Responsibility, once outsourced to journalists and juries, returned home to living rooms and bus stops, and it carried the unmistakable imprint of Jasmine's disciplined quiet. Her victory delivered yet another lesson about institutional redemption. The idea that creaking systems, though sluggish and scarred, can pivot when incontrovertible proof meets unblinking moral vision. For years, committees had tolerated distortions as political sport, but in a single afternoon, they referred a media titan for federal investigation, acknowledging that propaganda disguised as news posed a national risk. That pivot demonstrated that broken mechanisms can grind forward if pushed by irrefutable documentation and public scrutiny in equal measure, and that when officials resist change, they do so at the peril of legitimacy. Teehee Capital, once echoing with complacency, reverberated with bipartisan talk of press ethics reform, a sign that truth, when made unavoidable, can still prod legislation out of gridlock. Jasmine's silence forced lawmakers to confront their complicity. How often had they let lies slide when those lies served their short-term agendas? The investigation into dark money media ties expanded, implicating lobbyists who assumed they operated beyond daylight, and the ripple touched every corner of the political industry, from pollsters to pundits. Institutionally, the hearing proved that oversight remains possible when facts are supported by public demand and anchored by moral clarity. It reminded cynics that transparency is not a relic of some bygone golden age, but a tool always available, provided someone is brave enough and persistent enough to wield it. Institutions, like the people they serve, can relearn accountability if confronted by evidence sturdy enough to hold their gaze. All of these strands braided together into a final, human lesson, articulated when Jasmine finally broke her deliberate quiet on public square. Asked if she regretted toppling a media empire and setting off layoffs and investigations, she paused, letting the host and the nation lean into the hush. A smile spread across her face, not triumphant, but certain, as if she were unveiling a truth so simple and ancient it hardly needed words. "No," she said, voice calm yet carrying the weight of generations. "Because truth doesn't need protection. It only needs someone willing to open the door." In that line, she condensed every frame of the hearing, every document, every heartbeat of restraint, into a guiding principle. Truth, she implied, is like light in a shuttered attic, permanent, patient, and ready the instant a window lifts. Her words became a blueprint for an age struggling under the noise of unchecked narrative. Proof that defending reality does not require armor, only the deliberate courage to unveil what already exists. In living rooms across the country, parents quoted her to children. In classrooms, educators printed the sentence on bulletin boards. Protest placards carried it through city streets, and aspiring journalists taped it above their laptops as a vow. Because the truest lesson ringing from the marble chamber, through fiber optic cables and into human hearts, was that you cannot kill a truth once it dares to speak, and you cannot silence a people once they recognize that their quietest convictions can thunder louder than any manufactured lie. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.